Spotlight, lectures and performances on and around Albany State University.
Thank you and welcome. Economics is the study by which people make and spend their income and the choices to satisfy their needs and wants. Economic thinking arises from scarcity, which exists because wants and needs are unlimited, but resources are limited. And economic freedom is an individual's freedom to make economic decisions. Understanding economic freedom is germane to understanding our role as citizens. The study of economics and economic education can no longer be taught in a silo, typically in macro and microeconomics courses. But the discussion of economic freedom is one that must cross discipline and instructional platforms with the ultimate goal of building a society of free-thinking individuals. Undergraduate students at historically black colleges, while met with competitive curriculum, should be granted the opportunity to engage in open dialogue and open discussions about economics. Information acquisition, information processing, and information sharing allow us to explore economic education in a holistic, practical approach that opens the discussion and stimulates debate. And this morning we hope that we're able to do that. No longer can students look to the historical events of yesteryear simply through the negative lens, but should look to gain a better understanding of the positive economic opportunities that have existed within our community. In particular, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Bottom in Detroit, Michigan, or Sweet Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Catalina Mons, Professor of Information Systems, co-director along with my colleague, Dr. Cynthia Bennett of the Center for Economic Education, Small and Minority Entrepreneurship. Today is our second event that will engage students and the Southwest Georgia community in a discussion about economics in general and economic freedom more specifically. 2 days ago, on March the 19th, I engaged a group of students from the Young Black Thinkers Society, which comprised of students from Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University, Georgia State, and I was happy to see some of my students from Albany State who drove to Atlanta to engage in a Socratic discussion about economics. And the discussion opened with the works of Frederick Douglass from his writings, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, written in 1854. And Mr. Douglass goes on to say, "There I was immediately set to caulking and very soon learned the art of using my mallet and irons. In the course of 1 year from the time I left Mr. Gardner's, I was able to command the highest wages given to the most experienced caulkers. I was now of some importance to my master. I was bringing him from $6 to $7 per week, sometimes brought him $9 per week. My wages were $1.50 a day. After learning how to caulk, I sought my own employment, made my own contracts, and collected the money which I had earned. My pathway became much more smooth than before. My condition was much more comfortable. I was now getting, as I said, $1.50 a day. I contracted for it, I earned it, it was paid to me, it was rightfully my own, yet upon returning Saturday night, I was compelled to deliver every cent of that money to Master Hugh. And why? Not because he earned it, not because he had any hand in earning it, not because I owed it to him, nor because he possessed the slightest shadow of a right to it, but solely because he had the power to compel me to give it up. The right of the grim-visaged pirate upon which the high seas is exactly the same." And by the end of what had hoped to be a 1-hour presentation to the Young Black Thinkers Society that went more than 2 hours, we had touched on topics ranging from short-term to long-term gain, buying habits, character, choice, socialism, capitalism, Marxism, financial literacy, globalization, shopping in the Black community, power, greed, economic development, the metaphysical even balance, and entrepreneurship and freedom. Evidence of our need to continue the dialogue about economics and economic freedom. The program will proceed as printed, and we will bring the introduction of the speaker by Ms. Ashlyn Johnson, who is one of our Charles Koch Foundation Fellows. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Larry W. Reed became president of FEE in 2008. He was a founder and president for 20 years and in the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. He also taught economics full-time and chaired the Department of Economics at Northwood University in Michigan from 1977 to 1984. He holds a BA degree in economics, MA degree in history, and 2 honorary doctorates in public administration and law. Reed has delivered at least 75 speeches annually in the past 30 years. His best-known lectures include 7 Principles of Sound Policy and Great Myths of the Great Depression. His interests in political and economic affairs have taken him as a freelance journalist to 81 countries in 6 continents. His numerous recognitions include the Champion of Freedom Award from the Mackinac Center of Public Policy and the Distinguished Alumni Award from Grove City College. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Larry Reed, President of Foundation of Economic Education.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashlyn, and thanks also to Dr. Mons and Dr. Bennett and the Center of Economic Education and the university for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay, great. I've only lived in Georgia 3 years this very month, in fact, so I'm still discovering parts of the state that I had never seen before. And this is my first visit to Albany and to Albany State University, and it was a beautiful drive. So I'm just delighted to be with you, and I appreciate your taking the time to hear what I have to say. My topic today is 7 principles of sound policy. And I hope you'll see this talk as relatively well organized around 7 particular principles. I want to talk about each one, give you some stories to illustrate those principles. But I first want to begin by saying a little bit about the title itself. 7 Principles of Sound Policy. First, a word about sound policy. All of us, every day, have a keen interest in policy being sound, strong, right, positive. We live in a country where policy, as determined in places like levels of government, state, federal, and local, and also policies of private organizations and business, we're impacted by those things all the time. And fortunately, because we live in a country where we don't have a dictatorship, we ourselves can help determine policy. We can run for office. We express our views on policy every time we cast a vote. And of course, we can write and we can speak and we can try to influence others. It's a blessing that many people in the world don't enjoy. So what about the first part of the title, 7 principles? What's so important about principles? I want to impress upon you as I begin, and before I tell you what the 7 are that I want to stress, that having principles in the first place is very important. A principle is a belief. It's a core belief. It's something that you've come to accept because you believe it's rooted in good ideas. It's proven, it's been tried and shown to be right, or it's rooted in strong moral concepts, whatever. But at least it's something you can say, I believe in that. And let me tell you that there are lots of people who go through life who really could never tell you what their principles are because they've never given much thought. And if you don't give a lot of thought to your principles, you might find over time, or at least if you later realize this and look back, you might say, wow, I was all over the place. My principles were very inconsistent. I thought I believed in some things and I behaved that way, but then later I found myself doing things that seemed to contradict what I was doing before. Most people come to respect others, even if they disagree with them, if they see them as having principles that they believe in and being consistent in the way they apply those principles. How many of you have ever seen an old movie starring the late comedian Groucho Marx? Anybody? He's been dead a long time, died in 1977, and his movies go back to the 30s and 40s. But he was a very funny man, and in one of his movies, he played the leader of a country, and he makes the statement at one point to a crowd of people. He says, "Those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." Which is another way of saying, I really don't have any. You know, I'll have a principle for the moment if it pleases you, but in the next moment, if you would like, I'll change them. But, you know, you wouldn't say a person really had principles if what they believe in changes with every breath of air. You really got to have something that you are willing to stick by, come hell or high water, to be able to call it a principle. And that's what I want to give you today. These are not the only principles that anyone could argue should be important for creating public policy. But I think, at least in my belief, these are 7 very important ones. We could probably come up with 7 more. But these 7 I have put together because I think they are very important. None of them, I should tell you, is original with me. You may recognize a lot of them as coming from someone else that you know or have heard of. I didn't create any of them. I simply assembled them because I thought they were important, put them in this talk, and then I'll share with you some examples and stories from my own choosing and own experience that will help make these principles come to life. None of them, by the way, are complicated. In fact, you may think when I tell you them at first, you may think, well, gee, everybody knows that. This is very simple. As simple as they may sound, these principles are also extremely profound, very important. And by the time I'm done today, my guess is you'll be able to look around, think of the situation in the world and think, wow, as simple as these are, there's an awful lot of the world that hasn't yet really come to appreciate them, that really isn't practicing them. But if they did, whether it be in our state capitals or in Washington or just around the country or in any country, if more people understood the principles that I'm about to share with you, and maybe even more importantly, not only understood them, but actually practiced them, lived up to them, created policies that were consistent with them, I think we'd have a much better world. It'd be more productive, there would be less conflict, there would be more prosperity. That's why these principles I'm about to share with you are so important. Here's the first one. Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. Now that usually jars an audience at first when they hear that, until I describe what I'm talking about here. Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. Now, what kind of equalness or equality am I talking about here? I should tell you first what kind of equalness or equality I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about the very critical component of a free society we call equality before the law. That's not an issue here, and I would hope all of us would be staunchly in favor of that. That's a goal that we sometimes fall short of, but it's one that we should always hold very high. The idea of being equal before the law, and that's the idea that, well, you should be judged, if you're accused of something, you should be judged innocent or guilty based upon simply, did you do it? And that should not be affected in any way by things like your religion or your race or where you were born. Those are irrelevant. The law must be blind to such things, and it must treat all people equally, equality before the law. I'm not talking about that in this first principle. I'm talking about economic equality. It's a very narrow view of it, but it's a very important one because, needless to say, economics is pretty important to life, isn't it? It's what explains how we produce and what we consume and so forth. You get that right in life and you can live in a free and prosperous society. So it's very important, but it isn't everything. But it's nonetheless very important. Free people are not going to be equal economically. And I mean by that, they're not going to have the same in material possessions or income that they generate in the marketplace. If people are free, they will, in other words, so this is another way of saying, they will generate differences in material incomes, economic incomes. Let me give you just 3 reasons why that's the case. There are probably many more than that, but 3 important reasons. If people are free, if you were kind of to stand back and just observe the planet as not a part of it, but just observe human beings, you would find that where people are allowed to do their thing, to be themselves, to exercise their uniqueness, you'll find they don't generate the same incomes in the marketplace. Some people have a lot more than others. Whenever that's the result of something that's artificial or politically motivated or the use of force, we have good reason to be concerned and to object. But if it's the result of simply people being themselves, being free, I think that's a cause to rejoice. Here are some reasons why free people will not be equal economically. The first one is talent. Our talents are different from one person to another, radically so. How many of you have ever skydived? Okay. Do you know any expert skydivers? I've met a couple. It's not a talent that I really want to develop, but there are some people who have done it hundreds of times. That's just one example. But free people have a huge variety of talents. Some people bring to the marketplace immense talent. And have you ever found anybody who didn't discover what their best and highest talent was until maybe very late in life? They sort of go along not knowing what to do, and then maybe at age 50 they discover, wow, I didn't know I had this talent, and suddenly they take off. I'll give you an example of that from the state that I used to live in, Michigan, where I lived for 33 years, 33 Michigan winters, none of which do I miss. But how many of you have never eaten anything made by the Kellogg company? Everybody has, right? Everybody's eaten a Kellogg product of one kind or another, breakfast cereal in most cases. You may not have heard of how that company got its start. It's a wonderful story about a man who discovered a talent rather late in life and accomplished some remarkable things. It goes back, I'll tell you this in just a few minutes. It goes back to the town of Battle Creek, Michigan, in the late 1800s. There were 2 brothers by the name of Kellogg. The older one was John Kellogg, later became Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, and his younger brother was named Will. And as they were growing up, people in the neighborhood would observe them, and the general feeling was John Harvey was really going to go places. He seemed to be the guy with the talents, the ingenuity, the ambition. He was a go-getter, but the feeling about Will was very different. People thought, oh, Will just doesn't seem to, nobody knows what his talents are. He doesn't seem to be much of a starter. He'll probably end up working for his older brother. That was the feeling. And in fact, right out of high school, Will Kellogg was tried several different ways to make a living, but none of them lasted more than a matter of months. He was a door-to-door broom salesman for a time. But he ran into trouble because he was a very timid sort of guy at that age. He would knock on people's doors with his brooms, and somebody would come to the door, and he kind of crouched down and say, you wouldn't happen to want to buy a broom, would you? He wasn't much of a salesman, and that didn't work very well. So eventually, after not succeeding at various ventures, he did what people thought all along he was going to do. He went to work for his older brother at a hospital that his older brother, John Harvey, had started in Battle Creek. John Harvey's hospital was huge, or it came to be over a number of years. It was known nationally at one point because of some innovative therapies and methods of treating people with illnesses. But John Harvey was a little odd at times. He'd come up with weird things, try odd things, some of which had some merit and some didn't. But his younger brother, Will, went to work for him in his 20s. And he worked for his older brother until his late 40s and never made more than $25 a week. In those days, that was not bad money, but it wasn't very much. That might be the equivalent of, $100 or more today. But one of his jobs at the hospital was to create the food that the patients had to have for breakfast. This was at a time when Americans had never seen breakfast in a box. A preconceived, pre-made, dried, flaked cereal. That hadn't been invented yet. But John Harvey came up with this formula, and he said to Will, this is what you've got to do. Every night, mix this stuff together, and it produced this very moist, kind of a gruel, and cover it for the night, he told him, and then the next morning when you come in, you have to uncover it, roll it out with a rolling pin, cut it up in squares, and serve it in bowls to the patients. He did that for years, but one night he forgot to cover it. And he went in the next morning and discovered that the stuff had dried out. And when he ran the rolling pin over it, it just flaked up. And at first he was in a panic. He didn't know, how's this going to go over? This isn't the way my brother said to prepare it. Will the patients eat it? Now it's dried and crackly, crunchy. But that's all he had, so he had to serve it to the patients that way. And guess what their reaction was? They said, wow, why don't you serve it this way all the time? This is the way we'd rather have it. This is great. We love the crunch. And bingo, he's now in his late 40s. And all of a sudden he gets this idea, wow, the patients love it this way. In fact, when they go to check out of the hospital, they're asking, hey, Mr. Kellogg, can we buy that stuff that you gave us for breakfast? Can you put it in a box or something? We'd like to buy it and take it home. We don't know any place where we can get something like that. So Will goes to his older brother and he says, I have an idea. We need to box this stuff up and advertise it and sell it, not just to our patients, but I think lots of people will like it. We can make a lot of money at this. And his older brother laughed at him and said, no way, I'm not going to let you do that. This is for my patients, and you did it wrong that night, and you got to go back to doing it the way I told you all the time, because that's the way it ought to be. Will kept persisting. He would come to him at regular intervals and say, hey, let me bring up that idea again. I think we can make money from this. His older brother always said no until Will was at the age of 46. He finally decided that this was such a good idea, he was going to break away from his older brother, strike out on his own, and try to sell this stuff and make a living. But first, his older brother didn't like the idea of him leaving. And he wouldn't let him do it without selling him the patents for it. Can you imagine that? And they had a strained relationship for the next 40 years until Will was in his 80s and his older brother was in his early 90s. They didn't talk for 40 years. But once Will bought the patents for it, then he moved to Dayton, Ohio, and started to test market various dried, flaked cereal. He only had enough money to really invest in one thing. So he tried wheat flakes and oat flakes and corn flakes, and he discovered that the corn flakes seemed to catch people's attention. That's what they seemed to like the most. So that's what he's going to put his money in. He starts the Kellogg Company, and their first and only product was Kellogg corn flakes. People really like the stuff. He's starting to make some money. Somebody comes to him and says, if you really want to make a lot of money, Mr. Kellogg, you need to sell beyond just this area of the Midwest. You need to take this nationally. You need to break into the New York City market, because if you can do that, if you can change New York City breakfast habits, you might catch the attention of Madison Avenue, the advertising agencies there. They'll join your team, help you promote this. You'll start selling the stuff nationwide and maybe even beyond. So now Will has a challenge. How do I get New Yorkers to buy this stuff in a box, take it home, prepare it the right way, put milk on it, and eat it? Because they never had anything like this before. The idea of buying your breakfast in a box, letting it sit on the shelf for days, that was brand new. And New Yorkers are notorious about not quickly changing habits because some outsider says, here, try this. So he really has to come up with a way to sell New Yorkers. Now we discover Will Kellogg had a tremendous marketing talent that we never thought he had, that most people who knew him never thought he had. He has to break into the New York market, so he comes up with this clever advertising campaign with a message or a theme to it. And that theme was, Wednesday is Wink Day in New York. That was the overarching theme. Wednesday is Wink, W-I-N-K, Day in New York. Here's how it worked. He went into the grocery stores around New York City and he said to the storekeepers, I've got all the paraphernalia, all the posters and the signs and the explanation of how this works for you to put in the window. It works like this. If a housewife comes into your store on a Wednesday and winks at you, she gets a free box of Kellogg's cornflakes. And here are the rules. If she comes in and winks at you on a Tuesday, you have to explain to her, sorry ma'am, it only works on Wednesday. Come back tomorrow and wink at me and I'll give you a box of cornflakes. Now, to us today it sounds kind of quaint, but this was kind of risque, in 1890s America, for a woman to go into a grocery store and wink at a man who wasn't her husband. Oh, you don't do that. So this kind of catches everybody's attention, and well, it takes New York City by storm. Housewives love it. They come in, they get their free box, they love the stuff, they go back and start buying it. In no time at all, Will Kellogg is sending trainloads of Kellogg's cornflakes to New York City. And from there, it goes nationwide and ultimately worldwide. In 20 years, from the day he left his brother's employment at age 46, 20 years later, Will Kellogg, the guy that everybody wrote off as having no obvious talents, becomes one of America's 20 wealthiest citizens. Now, I give you that as an interesting example of a guy who had tremendous talent, but he didn't even know it until the right circumstances came along and he was alert to the circumstances and allowed an idea to enter his head and begin to percolate, but he also had the courage to act. He also decided, at one point, I'm going to venture out, take a risk, and see if I can make this work. So we're different in terms of our talents, aren't we, in the marketplace? So that has to explain a lot of differences in incomes in a free society. If you have greater talent, either because God gave you that or because you simply have worked hard to develop it, trained hard, well, you may command much more income than someone who either doesn't have a talent or doesn't use the talents that he has. But there are other reasons that explain our differences in incomes. Aside from talent, you also have industriousness or willingness to work. Same thing. Willingness to work. Some people work harder, longer, smarter than others. And if they're working at the right thing, at making things that other people want and like and will buy repeatedly, they have a good shot at making a lot of money. So that helps explain a lot of the differences in incomes. But a third reason you may not have thought of is savings. Savings. In fact, I think it's amazing how a person's savings, especially over a lifetime, and if they've been good at reading the market or taking the right risks, managing their investments well, wow, they can see their income rise much more than what their labor income or wages might have allowed for. In fact, this argument, this factor, I should say, of savings is so important. Think of it this way. Let's say tonight somehow we equalized everybody's income in society. All across America, suddenly you woke up the next morning and you all have the same in a way of material or economic possessions. Your income is the same, your material wealth is the same as everyone else. Complete equality in economic affairs. I would say that by noontime, we'd be a very unequal people again, because some of us would spend it and some of us would save it. And over time, the difference there would show up even more dramatically. So the first part of this first principle says, look, if people are being themselves, being the very unique and precious individuals that they are, all of us being different, and no two people who've ever lived on the planet were identical. We all have our own set of ambitions and traits and goals in life and behaviors and so forth. We're all different to a terrific degree. If we're free to be different, to be ourselves, for reasons of talent, willingness to work, and savings, and other reasons, we'll generate differences in income. But it's the second part of this first principle that really is the most important, I think. Equal people are not free. Think of it this way. Let's imagine for a moment that you have found a society or a country somewhere in the world where you could say, wow, everybody in that country is economically equal. Nobody has any more than anyone else. Nobody's earning any more than anyone else. If you could find such a place, and if that's all you told me about it, I could tell you that that's a very unfree place. I just know it. You know why? What would it take to make everyone economically equal in a society? Let's say I'm the emperor and I put any one of you in charge of that job. I say, your job is to make sure everybody has the same. How would you do that? What methods or techniques would you employ to make that happen? Could you just give speeches about it and then it would happen? Could you just tell people, oh, hey, make sure you don't do anything that would cause you to have more than the next guy? And would you expect people to say, okay? So what would it take to make people equal? How would you accomplish that? There's one particular word I'm thinking of. The word is force. You'd have to use force. You'd have to put a gun at everybody's head. You'd have to say, now, don't be better at anything than anybody else. Don't be different. Don't be there first. Don't take a risk that everybody else isn't taking. Don't be smarter at your investments. Don't even be luckier, because we can't allow that either. I mean, you'd be making people at the point of a gun, something that they are not. We're not the same. So, often you hear people say, the gap between the rich and the poor, we should lament that, we should feel bad about that. Well, I do whenever that gap is the result of, say, artificial obstructions. When governments, say, pass bad laws that hold people back, that prevent them from going as far as their talents can take them. That's especially a nasty way to bring about equality, to prevent people from going as far as their talents can take them. I'm against that. But if people have simply achieved a lot because of free choice and voluntary cooperation, they haven't stolen from anybody, they've just made good investments of their talent, their time, their resources, whatever, I'd say, wow, more power to you. I don't want to drag you down and try to pull somebody else up that way. I'd like them to pull themselves up too. So free people are not equal economically, and equal people are not free. That's the first principle, and you're probably all wondering, is he going to spend as much time on all the other 6 as he did on that first one? We'll never get out of here. The others I go through quickly. The first one I think is so important that I spend a little more time on it. So that has profound implications, doesn't it, for making policy. If you pursue policies because you want, oh, well, we need to do something, we need to pass laws that will make people a little more equal economically, you may run afoul of the fact that, hey, you're trying to make people what they aren't. And that almost always leads to conflict and makes people less productive than they'd otherwise be. The second principle that I want to share with you is, let me open this up here, what's yours, you tend to take care of. What belongs to everybody or nobody falls into disrepair. What's yours, you tend to take care of. Plenty of exceptions. We all know people who, they may have owned something, but they didn't take good care of it. But that tends to be exceptional. Most people tend to take care of the things that they feel, this is mine. Whether it's a good or an asset or even a family. If it's yours, it's got your attention. If it belongs to nobody or everybody, when I say everybody, there are a lot of countries like the old communist countries, they used to say, well, everything belongs to the people. The people's this or people's that. But what does that really reduce to? In most cases, that just means a handful of people who have political power get to run everything, and the rest of us have to take it or leave it. But if it's yours, you tend to take care of it. I remember years ago when I ran an organization in Michigan. We started out very small, just 2 of us. Eventually we grew it to about 35. But in those early years, we didn't have much of a budget, very little income. And so we had to scrape by, and yet we needed a camera. Whenever we did an event in the state or went to somebody else's event and wanted to get pictures, we had to have a good camera. But we didn't have the money at first to buy one. I had a decent camera that I'd taken all over the world with me. So I brought it into the office. And I said to the others, this will be sort of the people's camera. I'll just bring it in. It's really mine, but we'll treat it as if anybody can use it. If you got to go somewhere, you want to check it out, you can take it with you. Just take good care of it. What do you think happened to that camera? But these were all good friends. They all said they believed in private property. How come the camera was busted within 6 months? Because, they were using something that wasn't theirs. It just isn't the same, is it? If it's yours, you tend to take care of it. If it's somebody else's, you're not as quick to fix it if something goes wrong. You forget where you left it or whatever. It just isn't the same. This is important to understand. It really explains why the old Soviet Union collapsed. To a great extent, economically, because they said, well, we're not going to let people own very much of anything. We're not going to let them call very many things their own. We're not going to let them start their own business and call it their own. And we're going to have the people owning everything, which meant the politicians got to run it. Well, as a result, they went no place. They never produced much of anything that was in demand beyond their own borders. They were a basket case economically. A good example, too, is I have a friend, would you believe, he's actually the, not would you believe that I have a friend, I mean, would you believe I have a friend who is a president of a country. He's the president of Mongolia. And he visited me once in Michigan. He had been prime minister twice before his current term as president. I first met him after he was prime minister the first time and before he was prime minister a second time. And when he came to visit that first time, he went by the nickname of EB, the initials EB, because in Mongolian names none of us could ever pronounce. And I said, EB, well, you're here in our office. How often do we have a former prime minister visit us? So you have to give a talk. Please talk to my staff. Tell them what it was like to be prime minister of a country. And the best story that he told was this one. He said, when he came into office as prime minister, this would have been early 90s, it was after 75 years of communist rule. And he was determined to undo that and to allow people to have more freedom. And he said he discovered that all of the yaks in Mongolia were government property. Do you know what a yak is? Those big, hairy cattle. They had 25 million yaks, and they were all owned by the government for 75 years. Successive generations of yaks. He said, we never had more than 25 million. Over 75 years, the population of yaks under government control didn't change. He said, but I determined that I was going to get the government out of the yak business. So he said, I sold all 25 million yaks to the herdsmen, to the people who used to work for the government and take care of the yaks. But now we said, they're your yaks. You can buy them. 1, 2, 3, whatever. We worked out a formula so the government could get rid of the yaks by selling them to the people who were sort of tenants or taking care of them but weren't really their yaks. Then about 3 years later, I was over in Mongolia to visit him when he was prime minister the second time. And I said, Ibi, tell me what's happened with the yaks. And he got all excited and he said, well, remember I told you that we had 25 million of them? That's all we had for 75 years when they were government property? And then I sold them. I said, yeah, tell me what's the latest? He said, we now have 32 million yaks, up by 7 million in just 3 years. Why? Yeah, because all of a sudden now an individual who used to just, I got to take care of them because that's what the government tells me to do. It's not my yak. Now it's his yak. What does he do? Yeah, he says, wow, I got a male yak. If I go find a female yak, I can have little yaks. And I can make a lot of money. But I better take care of them because if I don't, that's my investment. I'll lose my shirt if I don't do this right. So Mongolia became a yak meat exporter in Asia because once the yaks were privatized. So if it's yours, you tend to take care of it. It belongs to everybody or nobody, or even another person. Generally speaking, we don't tend to take care of it. Most of you are not yet 21, so you wouldn't have rented a car yet, but I can tell you, I can predict in advance that when the day comes that you rent a car from time to time when you travel somewhere, I'm guessing that none of you will ever wash a rental car. But I'll bet you'll wash your own car. That's kind of the same principle at work, isn't it? It's not yours. You just don't take care of it as well. A third principle. Think of the long run and all people. That's the third principle. Think of the long run and all people. Not just the short run and a few people. Think of the long run and all people. When I think of this principle, I think of how often in our nation's capital and other places around the country that people make decisions, start policies or programs without thinking of the long run. They're only focused on the here and now, or maybe just this group and not all people. But wouldn't you agree that there are a lot of things you can do that might seem to be of benefit to this or that group for the moment, but which could cause problems in the long run, not only for all people, but maybe even for the ones that you were zeroing in on? Isn't it important to think of both all people and some people, and the long run as well as the short run? This principle really tells us to be thorough in our thinking, to think things through, think long term, think of all people. Let me give you an example. Imagine a thief who goes door to door in a neighborhood grabbing all the loot that he can get his hand on, and then he goes to the shopping mall and spends it in a whole lot of different stores. And let's say you come along later and you start interviewing the shopkeepers at the mall, asking them, well, what do you think about what happened? You might hear a lot of shopkeepers say, well, he stimulated my business. I hope he comes back. If he did that every day, I'd hire more people and that would stimulate the economy. Would you be thorough in your thinking if you concluded that, wow, we thought that guy was a thief, but it turns out he's a public benefactor. He stimulated the economy. At least that's what the shopkeepers tell me. You wouldn't be thorough, would you? You'd only be looking at the few people that he spent the money on. You wouldn't be thinking of the people he took it from. And you'd only be thinking of the short term, because sooner or later he's going to get caught. This is not a sustainable long-term prescription for economic revival. You'd only be thinking of the here and now and a few people and not considering the whole picture and the long run. There was an economist, a very famous one in the last century, that those of you who might be economics majors will know this name, John Maynard Keynes, Keynes. And he was a believer in things like lots of government spending and deficits in certain circumstances, running red ink budgets, creation of money, and so forth. And a lot of people have taken those ideas even far further than he would have. But he was asked one time, Mr. Keynes, if we follow your advice and we run big deficits in our budget and we print a lot of money, and won't that mean the dollar will go down in value, maybe become worthless someday? And his famous reply was, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. Well, you know what we laugh at that, but you know what that's really saying? What that's saying is, well, we can have a lot of fun doing this now here in the 1930s or 40s, and maybe in the year 2000 or 2013, maybe it'll cause problems, but we'll be gone. We'll let those people then worry about that. Well, that's not very responsible thinking, is it? That's thinking of the short run and a handful of people. It's not thinking of us in that case. So it's important to think long run in all people. Sometimes you'll come to a different conclusion about whether something is a wise move than you might if you just looked at the moment in the short run and a few people. The fourth principle, if you encourage something, you get more of it. And if you discourage something, you get less of it. If you encourage something, you get more of it. If you discourage something, you get less of it. You know what this really tells us? That you and I are creatures of incentives. We respond to incentives. If you encourage a behavior or an activity or whatever it may be, you'll tend to get more of it. People will say, well, if you're going to encourage me, I guess I'll do more. If I get more rewards for doing it, that's what I'll do. If you discourage any kind of behavior or action or decision, people will tend to say, well, I guess I'll do less of that, less reward in that, so I guess I'll find something else to do. That's because we respond to incentives and disincentives. If you want to encourage learning, if you want to encourage savings, if you want to encourage work, well then don't make it so impossible that people decide, well, that's not worth doing. Allow them to keep the rewards for their good decisions, then they'll make more good decisions. If you pay them for making bad decisions, don't be surprised if they make more bad decisions, because we're creatures of incentive. A fifth principle, nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. This is really another side of the coin of principle number 2, but I like to stress it a couple different ways. Nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Now, there's always an occasional exception to that. We've all bought something that we later thought, that was dumb. I forgot I had several of those already. I didn't need that. But that tends to be self-correcting. When it's your money, you're the one that pays the price if you end up buying something you really didn't need. And or if it's because you bought something and you discover later you were cheated, you'll tend to go back and complain, or at least avoid that behavior again. Nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. When you think of it, there are only a few ways to spend money. One way is when you spend your money on yourself. Okay, that's one way to spend, right? You're the one that's spending it, and it's your money, and you're buying something for yourself. You're going to make mistakes, but by and large, can you see that the connection between the person who earned it and the person who's doing the spending and the person who gets the benefits of the spending, the connection's as tight as it gets. It's all the same person. So you're going to tend to make fewer mistakes. Another way to spend is you spend your money on someone else. Okay? Not on yourself. It's your money. You earned it. So you have some incentive to be careful with it, but you're not buying it for yourself, you're buying it for somebody else. You know what a bridal registry is? You know why they came into being? Because I think too many couples said, hey, we got 30 toasters. We don't need 30 toasters. This was an attempt to try to rationalize that so that their people who wanted to buy them gifts to get married would not end up buying more than they needed or things that they didn't need. So we come up with ways to try to deal with that because we recognize it is an issue. You don't know the other person as well as you know yourself. So that's a little less efficient way to spend when you spend your money on someone else. How about when you spend somebody else's money on yourself? Okay, like a good example would be maybe the faculty will understand this better because we all end up doing this sooner or later in our careers. We go to lunch on an expense allowance, let's say, okay? And the department gets the bill or the university or whatever. You know, if it's your money, you look down the menu and you say, maybe I'll just settle for a hamburger this time. But when you know that, hey, I get to eat it, but somebody else is going to pay for it, you zero in on the lobster, okay? If you can get away with it. So that's not a very efficient way to spend. But the fourth way to spend is when you have somebody spending somebody else's money on yet someone else. Okay? So let's say, who does that? What organization in society does this routinely, just by its very nature? It's not a negative, it's just by its very nature. Haven't I just described the government? Because the government is some people who spend other people's money, and most of the time they're spending it on yet other people. In most cases, people they don't know. So the chances for abuse or inefficiency tends to be greatest when you break that connection between the earner, the spender, and the recipient of the benefits from the spending. So nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. That was number 5. Okay, number 6. And I do want to allow a little time for questions, so I'll zip through this. This one it's long and it has 2 parts to it. And it has something to do with government. Okay, since government is where policy originates, we have to get around sooner or later to saying something about it. This principle says, government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. Now, you all know that because you have good economists here, but there are a lot of folks in the world who kind of think, oh, if it came from the government, it's sort of like out of the air. It's free. Government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. And then the second part of it is, a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. It's kind of a trade-off there. A government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. Boy, a lot of countries in the world have found that out rather painfully. When people think that, well, if it comes from the government, it must be free, I'm really not paying for it, why not get it? And they say to the government, whatever you can send our way, we'll take. They end up with the government controlling most people's livelihoods and incomes, and into that whole mess comes corruption and people who seek office for the power rather than because they really want to do well and create a better society for everybody. Government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. It's not a fountain of free goodies. It's not from the tooth fairy. And a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. The final principle, then I want to open it up to questions. It may at first make you wonder, where does this come from? This sounds so different than all the others. The seventh principle is character makes all the difference in the world. Character makes all the difference in the world. I don't see how you can have sound, good policy if you don't have people of good character making it. People of bad character are going to make bad policies, another way of putting it. Well, I should say, what do we mean by character? We use that term different ways, don't we? Sometimes we speak of somebody, we say, oh, he's a character. I don't mean it that way. Or other times we say, that person has character. And when we say it that way, we almost always mean something very positive, right? I think character is something that's best understood if you think of traits, character traits. And here are some that I think are among the best. If you've got all of these and you seek to practice them and your people think of you as, wow, he or she really does all these things, I would say you've got solid character. What are some of those traits? One is honesty. Honesty. In fact, this is not only important to your character, I think it's important to whether or not we live in a free society. Can you imagine, how can you have a free society if everybody's dishonest? If you couldn't take anybody's word, nobody tells the truth. Everybody lies and thinks nothing of it. I mean, that would be unthinkable. So I think a free society really has to be an honest one. It has to be made up of honest people who will keep their word. People you can say, boy, you can take that to the bank. When he or she says that, I know they're going to keep their word. That's an indication of character. And when you keep your word, it has the benefit not only of building your character, you're improving the lot of everybody else in the process. Because everybody really, the bottom line is everybody would really like to live in a more honest world, right? You'd like to know that when somebody tells you something, they mean it and they're going to stick by it. We all benefit by people's honesty. Another character trait would be humility, being humble. Oh my, how many people these days are not humble? And I don't mean just in government, I mean everywhere, but I see it certainly on the news every night coming out of Washington. People who think, we can do magical things down here. We can command the economy and plan for 315 million people. I always like to say, wait a minute. Each and every one of us, if we're really thoughtful and humble, will realize that building your own character, managing your own life is a full-time job. Let alone trying to plan for everybody else. Be humble in the sense of recognizing that as smart as you may be, as much as you know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there you don't yet know. When you think of it that way, you realize, wow, gee, we all need to be lifelong students, right? You call yourselves students now. I hope you'll still be able to say you're a student when you're 80 years of age. Should never stop learning because there's so much to learn, and as much as you'll learn in your lifetime, there's still an infinite amount you'll never learn. That makes it a pretty tall order, doesn't it? Learning must be a lifelong project for all of us. So it starts by being humble. You may have heard the old phrase that the beginning of wisdom is to realize how little we know, how much more there is to learn. Another character attribute, I think, is optimism. Optimism. How many of you know a pessimist? Are they downers or uppers? Do they inspire? Have you ever been inspired by a pessimist? A pessimist is a person who, a pessimist will tell you, you can't do that. That ain't going to happen. Nah, forget it. No, it doesn't matter how good it is. Forget it. Don't work for that. No, future's bad. An optimist says, wait a minute, I can make a difference. And it starts with me. We can make a better future. I have to tell you, this is a rather personal story, but I discovered very early in life, I don't know where it came from, that I was an optimist. And people were telling me, every time you see a problem, you're always thinking how to turn that to advantage, or why that's good news, or what the good news is in what looks otherwise like bad news. But this really came home to me in 1980 on a very cold and slippery morning in Michigan. I was driving to work and down Main Street in our little town, and a car was coming the other way, wanted to make a left, and was waiting for me to get by. But at the last second, the driver apparently thought, oh, I got enough time. So he swerved to make his left. I swerved to miss him, and because it was a very icy morning, I lost control of the car. Flipped it upside down in the ravine alongside Main Street. But I remember like it was yesterday how I felt and what was going through my mind as the car was turning over. It ended up upside down with the window on my side busted out. That's how I got out of the car. But as it was rolling over, wouldn't you guess most people would be, bonkers? I don't know why, but I was completely calm about it. I was just serenely calm about it. And what went through my head as it was rolling was, I'm going to get a new car out of this. And I did. Now that's a kind of a natural optimism, isn't it? Well, I think optimism is important for a lot of, if you believe in something, whether it's your future, yourself, or a worthy cause, you need to work up some optimism for it. Because optimism is what will encourage you to do more, to work on its behalf, to get better at it. But if you're a pessimist, you're going to say, you're going to give up before you start. And you're not going to convert others to your cause. People will say, I'm not going to sign up for something you're already telling me is going to lose. History is full of examples of great causes that seem to be up against incredible obstacles and barriers, but were achieved because there were, in many cases, just a few people at first who said, I don't care what the obstacles are, I'm going to sign up for this because I know it's right. And I'm going to work for it, even if it's not achievable in my lifetime, because it's the right thing to do. People of solid character do that. People of solid, strong character don't care what the odds are. If they know it's right, they work for it. And they're quite often surprised at how what seemed to be impossible actually comes into fruition at a date they couldn't have forecast. So character is important. And that, I think, unfortunately, is our biggest issue in America these days. It's character. We're seeing an erosion of it. We suffer from a less and less of it every day. I see it in every walk of life, every occupation. People cutting corners, cheating, lying to get ahead, thinking only of the moment, forgetting the long run, not thinking of other people. And that's tragic. And it's destructive. Solid character builds strong and happy people and a strong and happy society. And I think to make for good policy and a strong future, that's something all of us need to work on. We need to be asking ourselves every day, am I good enough for liberty? If not, well, what do I need to fix? Do I need to be more truthful? I need to be more persistent or honest or courageous or humble or patient or responsible, whatever. If there's room for improvement, sign me up. That kind of an attitude can take you a great distance in life, and if we all practice it, would make for much better policy too. You've been great to listen to this long talk, and I know there's not much time for questions, but if there is, I'd be happy to take one. Thank you for being so attentive. Thank you.
Pretty
Thank you.
awesome.